fixable.
So we'll go ahead and get started. People may start trickling in.
Wait a minute.
Okay, wait a minute.
Okay, go ahead.
We have a room mic to try to help us pick up what you guys are saying. So just raise your hand before you talk, and Ayla will hand you this little box. Looks like this little thing. It's kind of a cute little thing, and just you don't have to hold it right up to your mouth. It'll pick up your sound, but it just allows me to record your questions. So some of the people listening online can't hear what the question is, and then I start talking and they don't understand what's going on. So, all right. So, is there a God? Is our topic today? And I kind of these next few sessions kind of excite me a lot. It all excites me, but these are so good. But I think it's always good again to put us in the right frame of mind before we start. So we're going to start with a song. You guys probably know Rich Mullins. Do you know who Rich Mullins is? This is a song he wrote based on, I think it's the Apostles' Creed, and it's performed by Third Day and Brandon Heath, and they just did a random recording session, and it got captured, and that's what this is.
Amen.
I like it. Yeah, when Rich Mullins sings this, there's a couple live videos of him playing it live. He's the one playing that thing and singing. I don't know how you can do that.
Because that requires a whole lot of
concentration, and then be the lead vocalist on top of it is quite an amazing thing
and
too.
That's a small one because they're huge. Some of them are huge.
Yeah, they're trying to mimic what Mullins used. And my understanding of the backstory of that video is they were on tour together. Brandon Heath was a new artist touring with Third Day, and they just did this backstage at one of the things, and they got captured, and that's the reason they look like they do in the video, obviously.
Their signaling is stern it is.
Yeah, I mean they're just kind of this is not polished, but it was very beautiful. But amen, I believe, right? Mm-hmm. Let's go ahead and start with prayer. Heavenly Father, thank you so much for this time together to share and learn, and more importantly, see the evidence that you have provided so that we can be confident in our faith. That we have a faith that's not blind. We have a faith that's grounded in evidence. And you've given us more than enough to be confident in you. Bless our time together as I know you always do, and thank you for being here with us. And I pray this in your name, Lord Jesus. Amen. All right, so as I've done each week, I like to highlight some books. All three of these books are from one gentleman. His name is J. Warner Wallace. If you don't know who this is, he was a cold case detective in Los Angeles for years. He's been on Dateline and he was in Gods Are Not Dead second movie as the detective in the trial, and he started out as an atheist, and then he decided to apply his cold case detective techniques to Christianity to disprove Christianity, and became a Christian, obviously. And like I said, if you like detective novels, the way he writes these books is kind of right up your alley. I know Mom's been reading Cold Case Christianity is the one that she's reading right now, and
we're over halfway done. It's fabulous.
What he does is he does a contrast between a case that he solved and the evidence that was considered more than significant in a court of law, and then what we have in Christianity. And he's like, it's overwhelming what we have, yet we accept less someplace else. So how can you not believe? So all three of these books are excellent. I only know Cold Case Christianity. I haven't read the other two myself, but highly recommend if you want to dig deeper on a lot of things we're going to be talking about the next couple of weeks. So this is our worldview puzzle that we've kind of been using. We're going to be focusing on what are the proofs for God. Now, obviously, we're Christians, so we believe in God. That's the reason we're here. But if someone was to challenge you and ask you, why do you think there's God? Are you prepared to answer that? And that's where we come in. So if I ask you, is there God? What's your answer? Yes. I barely heard you.
Yes.
Yes.
So yes, there is a God. But the question we have to resolve and be prepared to resolve is why? Why do we believe that? And each of us has an experience that has changed our lives. That's the reason we followed Jesus. But the what, the why, and the how is something that we have to wade through. And when we're confronted by people that disagree with us, it's good if we have evidence we can show them that is logical, reasonable, and plausible. And that's what we're going to talk about. And we're going to focus on what is called the cumulative case. And I'll be honest with you, there is no single proof for God that's going to convince somebody that doesn't believe in God completely. The idea is you want to keep putting evidences in front of them until it overwhelms whatever that thing is that they're using to resist God. And I think if we can prepare in our minds a very clear explanation, and I think you can show that the preponderance of evidence leans toward the God of Christianity. And we will go through that. Now, most of what we're going to talk about today is going to point toward a theistic God, not necessarily the God of the Bible. But we'll get to the God of the Bible. If you can get them to believe in a theistic God, you're almost there. Proving the God of the Bible is as simple as Jesus.
What does that term mean, theistic?
A single God. Theo God.
Yeah.
So theistic belief just means you believe in a single monotheistic God, a single God. So you believe someone created everything. That's really where we're trying to get. So let me just give you my own version of the cumulative case. See, we have a little teeter-totter here. Let's set this down. And what you'll see in the world today is the naturalist or the atheist think they have way more evidence than we do, right? In fact, they'll say their evidence is gigantic. It's a big block. And they'll put it on their side, and you can see it looks like it outweighs. You have no visual evidence of God. You have no proof of God. That's what you'll hear. But as we'll go through our conversation today, one block at a time, we're going to show that the evidence leans toward God. And in fact, we'll go through enough arguments, not today, but over the next couple of weeks, that you will be able to see that we have a preponderance of evidence that Jesus is God. He's the creator of everything. Well, to do this, you have to look at the proofs of the resurrection. You have to look at the proofs of the reliability of the Bible, which we'll talk about later. For today, we're going to concentrate on this: God versus the other worldviews. Okay? And cumulative case, I'm an engineer. We use this in everything. In fact, you use it in everything. When you're choosing a route to go someplace, you use the cumulative case in your mind. Which one's going to take me longer? Which one's going to have more traffic? Which road do I like to drive better? That effectively is the cumulative case approach. We use it in everyday life because it's a logical way to address things. Yet most of the skeptics of Christianity throw it away when it's talking about God. They use it every place else except when it comes down to God. Well, we need to not allow them to do that. We need to force them to recognize if you use it here, then it's just as valid over here. Any questions? Comments? So, the three most significant arguments for God are these. It's the beginning argument. It's called the cosmological argument. The design argument, which is called the teleological argument. I'll explain what those terms mean later. The morality argument, or the moral argument, but that is not even the tip of the iceberg. Another two that are really commonly used are what they call the being argument or the ontological argument, and then truth, which we talked about last week. The standard for truth is evidence to God. You have to have a standard. Well, that standard is most likely God. Objective truth has to be provided by a standard bearer, and the only one perfect enough to provide truth would be God. In fact, Jesus said He is the truth. And these are probably the five most common. The first three are probably ones you hear about a lot, but there are so many. And I'm going to just give you a taste. The design argument I'm going to break into several different parts, and we'll talk about that next week. That's going to be one whole session just because, well, it's a bunch of science and I love science. But you start looking at the other things that cannot be explained by the scientific method. Things like information. We take it for granted that we can process the world and take in information and collect data. There's no scientific reason that we can do that. Aesthetics like beauty, we talked about it when we did our truth, goodness, and beauty. We have this thing inside of us where we can kind of tell something's pretty and something's not pretty. It's just innately in us because God developed it that way, right? Another is consciousness, your mind. Again, there's no chemical process that we know of scientifically that is the basis for why we have consciousness. It's something that most scientists really grapple with, is this idea of where this concept comes from, and it's always very interesting to hear their excuses. The laws of science themselves, mathematical principles, logic and reason, all these things cannot be explained by science, because they're presupposed, or you couldn't do science at all. Obviously, purpose and meaning of our lives. We can't give purpose for most worldviews. If you're here for the worldview conversation, most worldviews view everything either as meaningless, empty, or some derivative of that. Where we know purpose comes from what we were designed to be. God gives us purpose. And we are most fulfilled when we are following the purpose that God has designed us for. Obviously, Jesus, his historicity, and the resurrection. When you look at the proofs for those, now you pointed directly toward the God of Christianity. Miracles and the supernatural. We'll talk a little bit about that when we get into science versus Christianity. And I have some personal experience on some of those. That's the reason I wrote that book, remember. Spiritual encounters like, there's so many people that actually feel like they've had personal encounters with God, not just near-death experiences. And those type of events are not explained by any other worldview other than the one we're going to be talking about. Have any questions? And that's a lot. And this is not even close. There's so many other really good arguments. And we're going to touch on most of these in the different sessions, so you kind of get a taste of it. But today we're going to be concentrating on 1, 3, and 4. And then we'll do number 2 next week.
You had to study all of these?
I don't know if I had to study all of
No, I
these.
mean, but for your doctorate, did your mind get boggled on some of that? I mean, that's a lot of information.
So some of this is postdoctorate, but and when I did a class on the proof of the resurrection and the historical Jesus, which was really fun, and you guys will hear a lot of what I learned when we do that session. A lot of this type of apologetics is kind of a basic, because they teach you the cosmological argument, which is how everything started. Mm-hmm. And they'll teach you the moral argument and the design argument. Those are the ones that they focus on for seminary purposes. The rest of these are things that you pick up through other conversations that are just obvious. And most of the apologists that go out there and that I admire and talk to people at college campuses, they've kind of broke these down. William Lane Craig is probably the best for breaking down all these different perspectives and giving you like a 1 or 2 word explanation for it that you can use with anybody. He just knows how to kind of pull things down to the bare minimum essential description, and it's easy to understand. So he's really good about this. But I'm not an expert on any of this stuff. You guys are going to know as much as I do by the time you're done, because I'm going to share everything I know. So, but I can tell you that science itself is a great tool for proving God. It's not what we hear in the world today, but it really is. If you really follow science, observation, and then searching for the cause, eventually you always end up back at the feet of Jesus. You just do, because, well, truth always floats to the top. So we're going to be focusing on these 5. The other ones we'll kind of pick up as we go through the other sessions. And so number 1 one we're going to start with today. It's the, how things came into being, everything that it is. This is the creation argument. Design is the fact that everything in the universe is really finely tuned, so much that it's beyond the realm of accident. Naturalism says it's an accident. All these random events lead to order, but all the rest of science says random events always lead to randomness. Randomness never goes toward order. That's what the second law of thermodynamics tells us. And so when science is trying to tell you the opposite of what science tells you, then it's a religion more than it is a science. And that's okay. We're going to talk about their religion versus our religion and look at which ones are most plausible. Any questions before we dig deeper? So I love these arguments. I'm going to start with one that may make your head hurt, and I'm kind of sorry about that. But so we'll put those on hold. We're going to start with the ontological argument. This is what they call the argument of being or existence, and it's full philosophy. I apologize, but it is a very compelling argument. Ontological, it's a branch of metaphysics dealing with the being or the individual existence. It comes from the Greek words onto or ontos, which mean individual being or existence, which that's the reason it's the study of this. So that's where the word comes from. This is another one of these, it's not just a Christian term. Ontological studies are outside of Christianity in a lot of ways. And unfortunately, it's one of those terms, it's like, why don't you just call it what it is? So we'll try to call it the being or the individual argument as we go through, but it's just the study of existence. Why are we here, basically? What's the concept? So we use the ontological argument to basically prove that God must exist in a logical manner. Let me just kind of go through this. So the ontological argument is a logical proof for God's existence based on the idea that God is the greatest conceivable being. The idea that if you can imagine something that's perfect and all-powerful, well, it has to be God. Because if you can't imagine anything bigger than that, then that's God. And everybody's opinion will be a little different on that, but eventually you are focused on what God is if you can conceive this all-powerful being. And it was first formulated by a man by the name of Saint Aslam, and he's in the medieval, I don't remember exactly when, somewhere in the 1200s, 1300s. He was a monk and a philosopher, and he argued that nothing greater than God can be imagined or conceived. That's the basis of this idea. And he went on to say, if God exists only in the mind, then a greater being could be conceived, namely one that really exists in reality. Therefore, God must exist in reality, because you conceive him in your mind. So his idea is basically, if I can think of God, and there's a God, then there's probably something else that's real that would be bigger than that thought. So by the very essence that I can think there's a God, then there must really be a God. It's philosophy talk, sorry. But it's this logical stepping along. It's like if you can believe and imagine something is all-powerful, you go through the omnis. Omnipresent, omnipowerful, all these things. And what you're thinking of is, in reality, the true existing God. So the ontological argument has been challenged and modified by various thinkers such as Descartes, Kant, and Plantinga, who have offered different versions and criticisms of it. But I want us to look at Descartes' ontological argument. We have a concept of God that as this supremely perfect being, that's what we believe God is. Existence is a perfection. A being that exists is more perfect than the being that does not exist. So obviously, if you can imagine something, if something actually exists that is like the thing you can imagine, then that's greater than the thing you imagine. As I told you, it's your head will hurt by the time we're done with this one.
It sounds like Ezekiel's vision of the.
It does. It does. So a supremely perfect being must have all perfections. So if there is a God, they have to be perfect, right? Therefore, God must exist. It's this, again, it's philosophical talk. Let's look at it a little more practical. So the main objection to this is this idea that it can confuse existence with like a property that you can tangibly hold on to. It does not account for the different personal concepts. That's what the major objections are. But it doesn't really matter what your personal opinion of God. If you can perceive in your mind what you view to be perfect, then a God would have to be that, whatever that thing is that you are thinking. And each of us will define perfect a little different. But if you can conceive something greater than what you just thought of, then you haven't got all the way to God yet. That's what St. Anselm is basically saying, is that when you get to the point where it's the greatest thing you can imagine, probably God, if you're being honest with yourself. So God's existence in the ontological argument. Ontological argument is a logical proof for God's existence based on the idea that God is the greatest conceivable being that we could have. Real being. I'm not talking about unicorns with wings. We're talking about something that's conceivable in the real world. And that's the ontological argument. I didn't want to go too far into depth. Go ahead.
Not being a philosopher, like, does anyone critique that and say it sounds circular?
That's one of the arguments that Plantinga would have put toward it. Is basically it's like this: you're talking about the metaphysical, and then you're trying to put the physical on it. So they feel like you're doing this. Most of these logical arguments have that same critique. But the question is, are you talking in a circle? Take a step back and think about it. So if I can imagine something that is perfect in my mind, that's all powerful, outside of time, outside of space, that can do whatever it wants, knows all is living at time, universal. If you can imagine that being, well, that being probably has to be God, because there's nothing else it could be. So that's the idea, where it sounds circular on the surface, but when you think about it, it's a directional thought. I take from my mind, and I'm saying if I can imagine it as a human being, then that creature has to exist, or I couldn't think of it in the first place. Because my mind's not capable of doing anything outside of what the Creator actually gave it. Now, the naturalist would argue that, but then why do you have a mind? And then the naturalist runs and hides, right? So yeah, this one, believe it or not, it's on the comeback, because some of the atheists tried to use this argument against Christianity. They got hammered pretty bad, but it's a philosophical approach to things, and it goes back to the great thinkers in Greece, and they use similar ideas. Now, most of them believed there was a God. They just didn't know who God was, or they might think there were gods, but they had this idea that there had to be a supreme, perfect being, and that's where the ontological argument kind of came from. It's like, well, if you can imagine that, then that is probably God.
Isn't it the same as what C.S. Lewis said, that if you can think of, like, you get hungry, you think of food, but you want to eat, so there's such thing as food. And
that is his ontological argument.
It's kind of like that. If you consider it, then it must exist, because you won't, like, there's water, like, you want to swim, there's such a thing as water that you can swim into.
Yeah, C.S. Lewis's approach was the idea that you cannot have a desire that doesn't have something that could fulfill that desire. You wouldn't know to have the desire. And he goes as far as,
sexual,
that we have something in us that only God can fill. We have a desire for God. We may look to fill that hole with other things, but we can only be fulfilled when we fill that emptiness with what God designed it for, which is Him. Again, that's another ontological argument. So there's a lot of them, but effectively is if you have this thing that you can imagine or you desire or you want, then there has to be something that would fulfill it. And as you go toward more perfect and more powerful, eventually it has to lead to the feet of Jesus. Okay, sorry to hurt your brains at the beginning, but it'll get a lot better. So the beginning argument, this is the cosmological argument, and I'll start smiling a lot because these are just so cool. I don't know how many of you have seen some of the Webb and Hubble telescope pictures, but this is, let me see what, I better follow my notes once in a while. See what this galaxy actually is. This is a galaxy named M101, and it is very similar to what scientists believe the Milky Way looks like. And so it gives us kind of a view of what our galaxy most likely looks like. It's just beautiful. You look at it and it's like, how can you possibly imagine that it came about by accident? I think astronomy is, well, it's just really cool. It's very interesting to see the science. And I'm a scientist by nature, as you guys know. So seeing these amazing pictures and then watching all the scientists try to figure out how to explain it is a lot of fun for me. So the cosmological argument. Let me, there are 5 major theories on how everything came into being. The first is the Big Bang. I'm sure you guys have heard of this, and I'll use a little object lesson for this. So the Big Bang is this idea that everything in the universe came from something about like that. That's the whole point. It's not small enough, it should be smaller than this, but from some singularity that's so small you couldn't see it, everything came from this, and then kaboom, everything came into being. That's effectively what the Big Bang theory is. The eternal universe is kind of like my teeter-totter here, and this was the most common, I can't get it to balance again, but this was the most common view of the universe in medieval times and before, in the ancient world, that the universe is eternal. And it's balanced in such a way that it never changes. Doesn't matter what we scurry around, we live, we die, but the universe itself never changes. That's the eternal, balanced universe concept. Another is what they call the cyclic universe, and I'll use my balloon. You guys, it's this idea that the universe is ever expanding, contracting. I'll see if I can do this. So you're going up, and then next time it's going to go back down to the same singularity, and then it cycles back and forth. There's some problems with that theory. Then there's the redefined time theory. I'll use an hourglass to kind of represent it. And there's variations on this, and I'll talk about it in a moment. But it's this idea that time's not real, that it's only our perception, or that it can be redefined in some way. Basically like turning over the hourglass periodically. That's the reason the universe restarts. Stephen Hawking is most famous for coming up with this concept. Of course, he decided he didn't like it and refuted it later, but that's another conversation. And then the third is the so-called multiverse model, which is the one we hear about a lot. This is this infinite possibilities argument, and they usually use, I can't believe scientists divulge this, but they say it's a bubbling brew or a pot of virtual particles and universes just pop into existence. And the scientists actually used the little bubbling pot model. Yeah, that's what they use, and I'm like, okay, a little too.
Where the primordial soup came in.
Well, that's even the next step, which is just as stupid as that one, I think. But so let's look at our universe possibilities. I'm an engineer, so we always use the black box model. So I'll put all the models into our box. So we have the Big Bang, we have the balanced universe, we have the cyclic expanding contracting universe, we have I'm screwing around with the time in some way universe, and then the one that's outside of the universe would be the multiverse generator. All the rest of them have to happen inside the universe itself, right? The Big Bang has to have taken place inside the universe because everything in the universe came from it. The balanced universe says everything's always been the same for eternity past. That model's inside the universe. Expanding, contracting, everything's still contained inside the universe. Then obviously the time warp. The multiverse is the only one that gets you kind of outside of the box. And that's one of those things we have to kind of look at. So, okay, so we'll talk about the Big Bang in a few minutes. And it's the most widely held perspective. And I think you guys will see the reason for that in a second. But let's just talk about the time adjusting or time warp theory that Stephen Hawking came up. And this is all really smart people coming up with a reason why there's no God. And they're really smart. They're very imaginative. So Stephen Hawking's idea was that you could that all time essentially is not real. It is this idea that we have this construct in our mind that we perceive time, but we actually don't experience time. And then about 5 years later, 5 years later, Hawkins came back and said, "This is a stupid idea." But it's still out there. And actually, there's a Japanese physicist. I was just reading an article, not just maybe 2 weeks ago. He believes in string theories, and he had this idea that it's just a construct. And it's like, how do you know? It's just
reading the article in Japanese, because that's what I'd expect from you.
Well, no, I can't read in Japanese, but luckily he speaks English and writes in English. But it's this idea is like, if you can imagine that the universe is really just conceptual. Some of these guys go as far as saying that we don't exist at all. That they have I can't think what the kind of brain they call it. They have a term. It starts with a B. This idea that there's one brain and we're all just part of the brain. It's like, that's like sci-fi. Okay? Yeah, it's all sci-fi stuff, right? And another might be that but they're scientists, right? And scientists believe in the scientific method, and they're always telling us that it is not reasonable to believe in God because you cannot believe in something you cannot see. But they believe in things like the time warp theory that you can't see, you can't test. It's only imagined, actually, I can't think of what this guy's name is, but he had this idea that he had a way to test and prove that time was not really real. And he was going to use a particle accelerator. I don't know if anybody knows particle accelerating stuff. I did a little bit of that when I was in graduate school, so I got interested. So I decided, let's see what he has to say about this. He said, yes, you could prove that time wasn't real if we had a particle accelerator the size of the known universe. And I'm like, what? I mean, I was like, how can you take serious science, which is, I mean, if you can imagine building something the size of the known universe, and that's what's necessary, it means you're
Needs to be God.
well, yeah, you're kind of making yourself God, and one, you're drinking a punch that maybe you should drink less of. That's the only thing I can think of. It's like, so I think we can rule that one out as plausible. Now, it could be, but it's not very plausible. So let's look at the next one. The next one, I think, is the balanced universe concept, right? This is, like I said, it was the most commonly held view in the ancient world. And, well, frankly, science doesn't support it, because we have the second law of thermodynamics. The second law of thermodynamics says basically everything moves toward chaos, effectively, right, or disorder. So you get less and less useful energy as time moves forward. That's what our science tells us. You can't use science to prove this theory, because if your theory is right, then all of our science is wrong. So it's one of these things where observable science says second law of thermodynamics is observed, tested. It's something that we can say is verifiable. Yet, if you're going to have this theory, you have to throw that out and say, I guess on a big scale it doesn't work. And like I said, that's where it crosses a line into neither logical, reasonable, or scientific. It becomes a belief. And obviously, beliefs are, well, they're what they are. So we'll say that one's less plausible. So that leaves us with the expanding and contracting universe. And this one's been around for a while. In fact, it was pretty predominant when I was a kid, this idea that the universe would expand to a certain state and then it would slowly shrink back down to the same singularity and it would just go through this cycle over and over again. Well, but science has moved forward since the 80s when I was a kid, and we now know that the expansion rate of the universe is accelerating and not slowing down. And, well, that kind of blows that theory completely away, right? Because for this theory to be true, the acceleration rate has to be slowing down. From the point of the singularity, it would accelerate out and slowly slow down until it reached equilibrium and then it would come back. So the fact that we can observe the universe, especially with these powerful telescopes, and see that the expansion rate of the universe is actually accelerating, we can say bye-bye to the cyclic model of the universe. So that leaves us with two. The Big Bang and this multiverse generator concept, which is outside the universe. Does anybody know where the multiverse idea came from? I don't know if you guys are going to laugh.
Stanley. Oh, I was going to say,
The multiverse actually was first coined in 1895 by a guy by the name of William Jones. And what he meant by multiverse was multiple possibilities. He wrote a book, then this idea was that every choice we make in life could lead us down a different path with different end results. That was his idea. And he used the term multiverse as multiple versions of ourselves, not multiple dimensions. In 1963, Marvel Comics picked up on that term and wrote Avengers number 185, which was the birth of the multiverse concept, where you had different dimensions and different universes, and they're basically different copies of us in these infinite number of universes. It's a comic book. Okay, so speed forward to the 2000s, and guess what science does? We look to comic books to come up with our new theory, because the problem was we're stuck with the Big Bang, and if you have a Big Bang, you have a issue if you're a naturalist. So they came up with this idea, and what's funny is they've run all different kinds of variations on this concept, and what I think is interesting is they've gone so far as to define 26 different dimensions of existence. This is the latest one. I can't remember what the guy's name was, but it's like, I don't know how he came up with 26. I can only perceive, 4 myself. You got 3 spatial and 1 time. Why 26? I don't get it. But I guess it's this idea that nobody can refute him because he has all these, and he doesn't have a description for it, but it's this idea that there's multiple layers of existence that we just can't perceive. So how do you perceive it? It's got to be the question you got to ask the guy. It's like, if you can't perceive it, then why are you talking about it? It's not science. It's science fiction, right? and so that puts us in the awkward position for the scientists. And I want you to listen to Lawrence Krauss. Lawrence Krauss he's out of Arizona State University. He's a really outspoken atheist. He was kind of the second tier of the new atheists. And he wrote a book, and this is a clip from Stephen Colbert's show. Just listen. It's glorious. Yeah. Keep praying, keep doing, and keep putting rocks in the shoes. Before we start talking about Lawrence Krauss, this is a book on quantum mechanics. So I can tell you fairly definitively what he's talking about. Quantum mechanics is not in quantum mechanics. The quantum mechanics does not predict, but he uses that, and you'll see this often, especially with the skeptics that are trying to attack Christianity. They'll throw out stuff like, oh, this is what it is, and they'll try to overwhelm you with either science or with philosophy or whatever your weakness is in a way that they know you can't refute because you don't know this.
Yeah.
Okay,
You don't
but
know what quantum mechanics
don't know what
is.
quantum mechanics. I mean,
And it's just like, oh, it's quantum mechanics explains it. It's
yeah. I
like,
mean, how many people know what a Laplace transform is? You probably do, but it's it's like It's just science. It may be sophisticated science, but there are a lot of people that know this, and none of them know that. Whatever sci-fi concept he was spouting. But people,
None of what he said to me made sense. I mean, it was just like a bunch of mumbo jumbo. He's just grasping at straws to try to explain what he thinks he knows.
I think you see this a lot in the skeptics of anything. Actually, if I'm trying to shut down your idea because I don't like it, I'm going to overwhelm you with stuff. Most of it might be meaningless stuff. We see this in every frame of or walk of life, where if I don't have a good argument, I'm going to give you like a whole bunch of stuff. None of it is relevant. But the volume, I'm going to try to use the cumulative case approach on you without having any evidence. And it's really common. We see it in Christian circles all the time. You see in a debate, they'll list off 50 scriptures. You go look at those scriptures and it's like, that has nothing to do with what we're talking about.
Yeah.
They list them out for the weight because you can't check them that quick. But if you had to read all of them, you'd go, I don't have to have a doctorate degree to understand that you just blew a bunch of hot air. And unfortunately, it's a common human approach, and Krauss is essentially using it. And I like, this is out of his book, and it says, physics has changed what we mean by nothing. It's empty space and a boiling, bubbling brew of virtual particles popping in and out of existence. If you wait long enough, that kind of nothing will always produce particles. Can you see a problem with his premise?
He's contrary to first law and thermodynamics is law of conservation.
That's true. It's even worse, though.
You cannot create energy. It's state as it is, transformed to different.
How would you describe the universe? Space, matter, and time, right? That's the universe. Look at what Krauss actually did in the explanation. Empty space, virtual matter, and time. So really what he said, that if you have space, time, and matter, you can make space, time, and matter. Duh. It's this idea that he had all these fancy words, but he's really saying if space exists, which means the universe already exists, if particles exist, which means matter already exists, and if you wait long enough, which means time has to exist, well, yeah, we believe that too. If you have space, time, and matter, you can have space, time, and matter. But they're blind because they're looking for an argument that proves to the world that God doesn't exist. And you actually should ask questions, why do they care? If God really does not exist and I'm this ultra smart person, why would I care if you believe in God? Because he doesn't exist.
The ultimate sin from the fall is really self-justification, right? I mean, it's, God's way or my way. We tend to want to choose our way until we start to see God's ways better. But the two ways in which you can remain in your way are you to either, talk away God is one of the forks. The other fork is I admit God exists, but I'm doing such a good job of working towards, being faithful to my religiosity. I'm such a good man that I'm good now, so now I can look down on other people. But those are both, self-justification.
Oh, definitely. That's spot on. And I think that's the reason the atheists work so hard to disprove God, because they want the self-justification. They want more people to come with them, right? Because that gives them a cumulative case in their own mind that they must be right. If they can convince a bunch of people that they're right, and then there might be more right than they think in their own minds. I think when people try to justify things that are not relevant to their existence, there's always an agenda. And the agenda is usually they don't really believe it, and they're looking for someone else to support their idea in a way that helps them to keep their belief going. But yeah, Krauss's idea is like, I think the multiverse generator has to be no. And there's a couple other reasons for that. If there was a multiverse generator, it would have to be highly sophisticated. It have to be detailed in its design to be able to generate things. It actually doesn't get you past the creator perspective, because what created it, and for it to be so sophisticated, it has to be a very intelligent creator, you end up right back to God, honestly, because you have to get back to the first cause, which is the reason you're stuck with the Big Bang. And in fact, most physicists get there. This is Stephen Hawking and Roger Penrose. They're both Nobel laureate physicists, and they say almost everyone now believes that the universe and time itself came into a beginning at the Big Bang. And they're saying basically all the other alternatives just kind of fall apart. Alex Vintgen says this, that the proof now is in place in cosmologists can no longer hide behind the plausibility or possibility of a past eternal universe. There is now no escape. They have to face the problem of the cosmic beginning. And these are all atheists. What they're saying is all these different cosmological arguments that we went through are not supported by science. They're supported by imagination. And so they came back, okay, they believe in the Big Bang. And the question is, okay, if we're stuck to the Big Bang, what is the obvious question we have to ask? Well, if you have a Big Bang, then you pretty much need a Big Banger, right? There has to be something that was powerful to make everything out of nothing, is spaceless, timeless, and that starts looking a lot like the Christian God as you go through. So that's pretty high level, but you can see that the beginning argument, although it is not definitive proof for God, it's pretty tough you can't disprove God looking at the beginnings argument. The most plausible, there has to be that first cause that's outside of the universe, and however you define it, it looks more and more like God, right? But again, that's just one argument.
It is accepted now in science that there was a beginning. Before, there's not.
No,
now they know. They can test it. There's some evidence that there was a beginning.
Yeah, and we'll talk a little bit about that when we start looking at the teleological, we start looking at the telescopes. The evidence that we see of the beginning of the universe, well, you think about it, okay. Is anybody taking astronomy at all? Maybe it's just me, but you look at a star out there, it's a finite size, or even if they're really big, they're only a certain size. And they're burning, right? Our sun takes a hydrogen and go through a fusion reaction, produces helium, right? It only has so much. So at a certain time, it's going to run out. And we know that. They talk about supernovas and all these different processes that astronomy has proven that we've been able to observe, that stars run out of fuel. Well, then what? Why do we still have stars if the universe is billions and billions of years old? They're starting to come up with some theories for that one. But
birthing planet. Planets.
Now they have a birthing star regions in the universe. But you got to come up with excuses. So the science fails. So now I have to come up with science fiction to come up with an explanation of why my explanation doesn't work. And then that's what usually happens. You look at the science, and the science is actually pretty clear. And then you're stuck with, well, if the science is clear, then my explanation doesn't really work very good for me. It means there's a beginning and there's an end. That's pretty strong support for the Bible. And now they have to come up with something else to try to get there. We'll talk about that a little later. Now, the moral argument, I think, is probably one of the most compelling arguments, personally. This is a non-scientific argument, but it's really simple. Right and wrong. How do you know what's right and wrong? There has to be a standard that you compare right and wrong to. But intuitively, we seem to know right and wrong. Now, we may have different opinions when it's personal, when I have an advantage. When you're looking at somebody else, or it happens to you, you probably know what's right and wrong. And so the moral argument typically goes like this. If God does not exist, objective moral values and duties do not exist. So if God doesn't exist, then there's no standard for morality. Objective moral values and duties do exist. We know that there's When it's bad to us, we pretty much know it's bad. So therefore God must exist. That's the moral argument. This idea that there's a standard that is pretty clear that what right and wrong is. Now, people may have opinions, but opinions don't change truth. And we kind of went through that last time with the law of non-contradiction. Relative truths usually fall apart when you look at the law of non-contradiction, which basically asks the question of itself, and then you can tell whether it's true or not. And that's moral truth, the real objective truth about moral values and duties are universal no matter where you are, when you are, or who you are. And that's how we know that there's some sort of a standard. Now, people will argue about this, and let me play another short video. Remember who this is by. I think this is William Lane Craig's group, it's Reasonable Faith. What do you guys think? Is there a problem with this argument you can think of?
I think the only challenge that you get is that, because of natural revelation, when you look at, say, other religious approaches, they will kind of come to like a common denominator without going through, well, I'll take it back. You're talking about just God exists, right? We're not talking about Christianity.
Not Christianity.
So external, no. There's got to be something beyond the individual.
Well, probably the biggest objection probably comes from Sam Harris. Sam Harris is one of the new atheists. He is an American philosopher. Of course, the new atheists, I think, are dead. They shut down their website recently, so I think that group is now gone. But he has a philosophy degree from Stanford and a PhD in neuroscience from UCLA. He was one of the group, Richard Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens, himself. Who was the fourth guy? I can't think.
The guy that does the Old New Testament. Bart Ehrman.
Well, Wehrman's still alive and kicking out there for sure. But anyway, Harris wrote a book. It's The Science of Values and the Moral Landscape. And here's just a couple of quotes from his book. He says, "Facts can be scientifically understood regarding positive and negative social emotions, retributive impulses, the effects of specific laws and social institutions on human relations, and neurophysical physiology of happiness and suffering." He goes on to say, well-being, or human well-being, entirely depends on the events in the world and on the states of the human brain. Consequently, there must be a scientific truth, or truths known about it. This is kind of his conclusion in the moral landscape. Apparent morals are explained by what is best for human flourishing. So his explanation is human flourishing defines morals. And we have that innate right and wrong because that's what helps our society to work together and flourish. Is there a problem with that?
I think you can only come. What's the name of the guy who wrote the book about stealing from God, basically? The idea that
Frank Tour.
Yeah, the idea that that argument comes from, it's kind of built on the basis of like an objective right and wrong.
It comes back to one question. Who decides what human flourishing looks like?
I was going to say, all of that still goes back to what controls it. Who controls it?
So, question is, how do you define it? So, do you want this guy to define it?
Human flourishing is
When he was exterminating the Jews, he thought he was doing what was best for the human race.
Exterminating the disabled.
Or the disabled? Or what about this one? He killed, 6 million Russians were killed under Stalin, and he was trying to get rid of the weak. He thought he was helping flourishing. Maybe Mother Teresa. Now, I don't know much about Mother Teresa, but I'm sure she had problems. I wouldn't want her to decide what was right and wrong either. Maybe this one? I don't know if you guys, this picture is a painting. It was, Akin Ramarick.
Yeah.
She had a near-death experience, and she met Jesus. And when she was an artist, and when she came back, she drew the Jesus that she saw. And this is the picture. I guess she was about 8 years old, I think, when she had that experience. Who knows if that's what Jesus looks like? But if human flourishing is the target of
Pretty close to Jewish guy.
yeah, well, and
Except the eyes.
my critique on Sam Harris is really simple. You're right. Human flourishing is the purpose of moral right and wrong, but it is defined by the Creator. There's a standard. Because moral right and wrong, having a standard actually does help human flourishing. There's a reason the world has seen such unprecedented human flourishing since Christianity became the dominant underlying for most cultures. The Western world flourished because of the right and wrong. They did a lot of wrong, don't get me wrong, but there was a standard that allowed community to be built. Most of our laws are based on what came out of Christianity, which was a standard of right and wrong. Without that, it's Stalin or it's Hitler. So another common argument is Richard Dawkins. He says, the universe we observe has precisely the properties that we should expect if there is no evil, no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. This is out of his God Delusion book. What's going on?
The dog.
Oh, that's not a good thing. So I'm going to play another quick video of William Lane Craig addressing Dawkins' argument, because the atheist says the world's just exactly like you should expect it. We eat each other because there's no moral right and wrong.
What are Richard Dawkins' objections to the moral argument? There are various forms of a moral argument for God's existence. A very simple one might go like this. If God does not exist, then objective moral values and duties do not exist. That is to say, in the absence of God as a transcendent ground or plumb line for moral values and duties just become sociobiological spin-offs of the evolutionary process. They're relative to time and place, culture, and individuals. So if God does not exist, objective moral values and duties do not exist. Premise 2 would then state, but objective moral values and duties do exist. In moral experience, we apprehend a realm of moral values and duties that impose themselves upon us. For example, that it is wrong to torture a little child for fun. But it follows from those two premises that therefore God exists. Now, what does Richard Dawkins say in response to this argument? Well, it's striking that in the God Delusion, he actually affirms both of these premises. On the one hand, he says that if God does not exist, then there is no good, no evil, nothing but pitiless indifference. He says we are just machines for propagating DNA. So he seems to agree with the first premise. At the same time, however, it's very evident that Richard Dawkins is a die-hard, stubborn moralist. His book is filled with moral judgments. For example, he condemns unequivocally the Incan practice of human sacrifice. He condemns the religious indoctrination of children. He condemns persecution and harassment of homosexuals. He condemns prizing cultural diversity over the interests of Amish children. He even gives his own amended 10 Commandments in the book for guiding moral behavior. So it's very clear that Richard Dawkins is a moral realist who believes in the reality and objectivity of moral values and duties. The problem is, in conjunction with that first premise, that implies that God exists. And Dawkins doesn't seem to connect the dots. He holds to the truth of both premises, but he doesn't seem to realize the logical implication of doing so, namely that God exists. So on pain of irrationality, Dawkins is himself committed to the existence of God.
In fact, since that was recorded and Dawkins wrote his book, he's begun to backwater on his perspective on Christianity. He now thinks Christianity is a good thing to teach. The reason is the woke culture has frustrated him so much, that the fact that is such it's nonsense to him that what's going on. So you need a standard to compare to. So always the Muslims in Europe are running amok and kind of destroying their society, especially in the UK. So Islam has been a problem. So Christianity was there before when they were flourishing. So yeah, Richard Dawkins now thinks Christianity is almost a necessity for a flourishing culture. He probably wouldn't like you saying that, but I've actually seen a recording of him actually saying
No,
that.
he said it's not a good idea to teach Islam in a culture, in a society. It's probably better to teach Christianity. That's what he said.
So I think things change as whatever the thing that's been impediment. Actually, I have hope for Richard Dawkins because that's a big jump for him from Christianity is evil to now it's a good idea to teach it. So he's coming closer. So I'm hopeful.
So just from knowing, like, has he ever actually looked into Christianities and trying to understand what actually Christianity says? Not just like the short dime store gospel of, you're a sinner and Jesus died for you, like that little abbreviated one, but actually looking at the holistic breadth of Scripture to see, like, what is the mental map, the moral map that Christianity lays out. Because if you look at the argument of, like, the evil things Christians have done, you can explain that on the Christian map. Because, if you say that, hey, we're separated from God and the path back is Jesus covering us, right? And when the laws were laid out, as man tries to achieve righteousness on its own, it actually creates a lot of bad things. And you can put on the map if you look at Christianity. Right?
No, I agree with you, and I doubt it. I know, he did a couple debates with John Lennox a few years ago, and from those debates, you could tell that Richard Dawkins had read portions of the Bible, but not holistically. He was reading it for fuel for his ideas, right? And you can read the Bible that way. I mean, you can read the Bible and think that it gives you justification for all kinds of horrible things. We're actually going to talk about that when we talk about can you trust the Bible. There are a lot of objections to the Bible. And there are reasons why people have those objections, but they're misreading the Bible. They're not reading it in context. And I don't think he ever has read it for that purpose. What I would wish for Richard is that he would try to disprove by studying the Bible. Because then you have more likely to be a Lee Strobel or J. Warner Wallace, very intelligent guys that decided they want to disprove the concept of the Bible. Peter Hitchens, Christopher Hitchens' brother. Even what was Steve Wood, the guy that fasted in the prison. David Wood. They all want to disprove Christianity, but they truly look into it with the intent of disproving it. Dawkins wants sound bites, right? And that's where he hasn't gone that next step. But I'm always hopeful for him, and you could. Well, I think if you look at his perspective, the fact that he's so adamantly against things, he already is making moral judgments, right? And I think that's what William Lane Craig was trying to say in that short little video is they want a moral basis for everything in existence. And I know I think it was John Lennox, it wasn't in one of the debates, but there was a conversation. They both teach at Oxford, and Richard Dawkins was really angry because he thought it was either cricket or rugby that someone had cheated. And he was incensed about this. And Lennox was really funny. It's like, well, Richard, if you're right, then they're just dancing in their DNA. and it's because there's no right and wrong. it's this idea that they want a moral right and wrong, but they have no basis in their worldview. So it comes back to that livability of worldview that we talked about in one of the earlier sessions. Is you can have a worldview, you can believe it, you can sincerely believe it, but you can be sincerely wrong. But you have to be able to live your worldview, which means you can't borrow from somebody else's when it's convenient, because then that means your worldview is not right. And in all of these are really smart men. But nonsense from the mouth of a very smart man is still nonsense. You know, it's just because they have a lot of degrees doesn't mean that they're making sense. And they don't. I mean, if you look at that's the reason I think it's good for us to go through these exercises and talk through their arguments, because they are full of holes. Because they're deviating from what makes sense, logic, reason, and scientific method, when that's what they say everything should be supported by, but their own arguments don't play out. You look like you have a...
I'm just thinking.
So, C.S. Lewis said this: conscience reveals to us a moral law whose source cannot be found in the natural world, thus pointing us to a supernatural lawgiver. And C.S. Lewis had a way of kind of just making the obvious really simple. And I think no matter how people try, they cannot get past this idea there's got to be a basis for morality, because it is somewhat uniform. What Chris was saying earlier, most religions get to the same basic moral foundation, maybe not the specifics, but the foundation, at least within their group. So that points you toward some sort of a standard that's outside of the natural world, or it wouldn't work out that way. So it's obviously pointing toward a supernatural something, the concept that we call God. Effectively, that's got to be the standard, because it's got to be outside of nature. Another good quote is this one from Blaise Pascal. Vanity of science. Knowledge of physical science will not console me for ignorance of morality in time of affliction. But knowledge of morality will always console me for ignorance of the physical science. You get it? Basically, science doesn't do anything to really help you when you're in the troubles that we face in life. But I can be completely ignorant to science, and if I know what right and wrong is, I can deal with the circumstances I have in my life. Pascal, one of the greatest scientists that the world may have ever known, is trying to tell us that science is not the end all, right? It's a tool, but it's more important to know right and wrong. And right and wrong, another one of Pascal's statements, has to come from the standard bearer, which has to be God. Okay, let's look at our arguments for today. So, cosmological argument, the argument of the beginning. So where do we get to with this? Well, the Big Banger has to be immaterial, outside of the universe, has to be timeless, has to be spaceless, or it couldn't have initiated the so-called Big Bang, right? It can't be part of the universe, it has to be outside of the universe. That entity, whatever that is, has to be extremely powerful to make something out of nothing, instead of what Krauss said, that it's just bubbling virtual particles inside space and time, I guess. That's what we know from the cosmological argument. And you can lay a couple of the omnis over this if you wanted to. It doesn't get you all the way to God, though. It shows you that there has to be some force that's outside of the universe that is very powerful, but it doesn't say anything really about the intelligence part. Now, morality or moral ethics, whatever our values are, because we know that there's a standard, there has to be something out there that is morally perfect, or they couldn't provide the standard. The standard has to be based on that, whatever it is. And what we're saying is it has to be personal, or we wouldn't see it as personal. Right and wrong is a very personal thing. If it was just a relative construct, why would it be so personal? It should be abstract. So the moral argument gets us to a personal creator of some sort, maybe not to the one that we want. And then the ontological argument and the standard for truth get us closer to the God of the Bible. Again, this is a cumulative case. No one by themselves take you all the way. But my argument is, I think you can see the God of the Bible's fingerprints all over all of these arguments. Now, people can argue and disagree. They can have different opinions on each one of these arguments, and they do. You talk to a Muslim or one of these other groups, or even the Jews that don't believe in Jesus, they'll argue some of these points. But we'll get to arguments that they can't argue against as we go through. But I think when you're talking about people that don't believe in God, the top two for sure, cosmological and the moral argument, are extremely powerful in making them uneasy with whatever their belief structure is. And again, we have all of these. It's a massive list, and this is not even a complete list, like I said before. And we're going to spend the whole day next time talking about the design argument. There's just too much to do it and do this all together. And I've broken the design argument into several different levels of creation, both the universe, the galactic, the solar system, our planet, life, and then subatomics. I'll get excited when I get to the subatomics. That's what I got a PhD in. But when you start looking at the design portion of this equation, it starts getting more and more obvious that it's pointing toward the God that we know in the Bible. And then when we get to the later sessions where we're talking about science that shows up in the Bible, I have to start smiling. It's just amazing. But our Bible shows, it's not a science book, but the science that's embedded in the Bible proves it comes from God, because as we get more and more scientific discoveries, you can find them in the Bible. But other religious texts that are available fall away because they predict things that are now disproven. And we'll talk about that a little bit the next time. So I wanted to give you guys just a little taste of the design, because Eric's not here. It's kind of true. There's so many reasons to believe in God. I like Peter Hitchens is the brother of Christopher Hitchens, one of the new atheists, became a Christian, and that's what he said. Is basically, you look through the argument as a reasonable, logical person, there's only one conclusion, because there's just so much evidence. It's not about believing as much as it is following the evidence. You believe what is supported by the evidence, because we don't have blind faith. Our faith is rooted in the evidence that God's provided for us, and that's what's so exciting. Well, any question, comments? This was a quick prayer, and we can talk some more. Heavenly Father, thank you so much for this time together, and thank you for giving us so much evidence of you. You're not going to overwhelm our will, but you make things available to us so that we can see you clearly if we only wish to. Your love is beyond our ability to understand, where you would love us so much to allow us to make the choice. And to choose you is the greatest thing we can do in our life, Lord. Makes this evidence that we've talked about today encourage us and strengthen our walk, knowing that it's an overwhelming case for you. And for all these things in your name,